I think the broader discussion is, okay, yes, it's always going to be that privacy paradox, right? What is privacy versus convenience? And everyone has a totally different take on that. Having worked what I've worked, I'm very stringent in that. That's not using my last name on this podcast, which I appreciate you letting me do. So I'm certainly not telling people to go bury their head under a rock or put their head in the sand. Nor am I going to go to the extremes that someone like Ted Kaczynski had as far as railing against technology. There's a reason why technology helps humanity.
What I really want to ask is, for aspiring security writers and communicators, what would your number one piece of advice be?
Well, I think it's right for clarity and not applause. I see a lot of the influencer culture coming over to LinkedIn, and I think there's good and bad with that. My goal isn't to be an influencer per se, but to inform you. So as a trained analyst, my goal is, what does the target audience need, and what is the what and so what?
What are the real world implications when attackers can impersonate trusted AI assistants right inside the browser?
Browser has always been, I think, the bane of a lot of CISOs' existence. And I get it, right? These new browsers roll out, people have different preferences. And so that becomes difficult, because how do we accommodate flexibility within a culture to maximize productivity without leaving ourselves widely exposed for security? And so I think what's happening here, and when we talk about the implications of attackers that are now impersonating trusted AI assistants inside the browser. And so what's happening, I think, with what we're facing is that this is really, whether it be the sidebar spoofing or enabling AI agents within the browser, it's really the next evolution for the threat.
Today on the Be Fearless podcast, we have someone who's been decoding what digital footprints mean for security and privacy. Also known as Mr. Digital Exhaust, James W. is the creator behind Smoke Signal, a newsletter and podcast that dissects the intersection of technology, security, and human behavior. With years of experience working with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, I'm looking forward to exploring his perspective. James, great to have you here.
John, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, let's start with a little bit about your career journey. You've had quite the career arc from working with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to now running Smoke Signal as an independent creator. What prompted the transition, and what's the story behind the name Smoke Signal?
Well, John, pretty simple. For me, I spent almost 23 years in public service, including more than 20 with the FBI. I've been writing on LinkedIn since 2019 and have really enjoyed the writing. It's just a whole different type of writing than intelligence analysis, but I wanted to make things relatable to folks as far as blending threat intelligence with a narrative form. I think that's something that's missing in that field. And in July 2025, I actually left government service and joined Valens Global. Super excited to join this company. They're a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, and they are really innovative and nimble in delivering advanced national security solutions. Really enjoy working with the team there in an analytic capacity, and it's been a blessing to join. So super excited to continue contributing in an area that I've done for almost 23 years, and just empower innovation in the private sector in the national security space. You asked about the Smoke Signal newsletter. So when I branded this, it comes from the oldest form of communication within humanity that we know of. Before we had those networks, smoke was how you warned someone that something was coming, right? And so what I try to do now is talk about how these invisible data trails, which are very difficult to decipher for most people, can be translated into visible smoke signals within my newsletter for them to read and act on in a way that's digestible.
Yeah, I like it. I think I like when I think of smoke signals, I always think of like the Lord of the Rings, and as Gondor is asking for help, they start lighting the fire, and you can see it from so many miles away, and you know that there's a call for help, right? The interesting thing about the digital exhaust is how not visible it is, right? And you hear people talk about it, meaning that you you know you see the memes where it's like someone's laughing, right? My wife asked me why am I whispering, and it's because Alexa's listening, and Google's listening, and Facebook's listening, and it's kind of like they all laugh, right, because you're whispering.
Yeah.
It's, and people say things like, hey, it's like all of a sudden I started getting ads after I had a query about this. And I think those are kind of the threads of digital exhaust that you're talking about. Am I getting it right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think to me, I define, the arc for me was really in 2019, we were really looking at kind of what it was. It's not a term that I came up with or coined, it was out there. So what I've tried to do is kind of develop the narrative with that within LinkedIn, because I felt like that was the appropriate platform to do that. As well as my work on the federal side, I've worked a lot with digital exhaust mitigation throughout my career and developed innovative solutions. What was individual became an ecosystem. And now that ecosystem actually powers a lot of what we have in AI. And so I know we connected on kind of the browser talking about that, and that certainly factors into that. But I mean, to be personalized, to know the user really comes down to the digital exhaust. And that's what we're facing, whether it be from a commercial perspective as marketing, or like what you and I deal with is how we secure different platforms and different tools to stay safe. And that's a lot harder than it used to be, as we were kind of talking about just before the show started.
Right, right. Well, during your time with federal agencies, you were on the front lines of real threats. Can you share a story or moment that fundamentally changed how you think about security?
Gosh, there's a lot of stories about that. I'm trying to think of one in particular, but I think for me, it was how exposed users were to their information being found. And I don't think people realized how readily available their personal information was online. Being a child of the tail end of Gen X, I remember the phone books, and I remember things still being analog, and it was a lot of work to find someone's home address. It was a big deal if you got their phone number. Now that's certainly something that is just a keystroke away. So when you have threat actors who would want to harm you physically for the work you do, or prevent you from getting to work because they don't want you to stop them from doing things, or socially engineering you based on what's online, you can really create a Rolodex in a hurry of someone's life and get to know them personally, professionally, and where their location is. And that's a huge disruptive problem. So it's what I refer to as a weapon of mass disruption.
Right. I mean, I think I was just reading one of your articles about different actors that are combing through LinkedIn and getting information about you, piecing those pieces together so they can launch a social engineering attack against you with all the information that you're just kind of leaving behind, just even on LinkedIn, and who your connections are, who you post, what you like on LinkedIn, etc. There's just so much stuff that we do in these social media platforms that can be put together and figured out to launch a attack. That
I mean, not a half hour before I joined the show with you, John, I just sent a screenshot to the folks at Valens, because a crafted spear phishing attempt. And again, try to be very careful in what I share. These things happen, right? And so it's not something that they haven't dealt with based on the work that they've done. But again, right, as you're out there doing things on LinkedIn, which many recognize as the number one counterintelligence platform in the world, these things happen, right? So it's really like you and I have kind of experienced, and what you've experienced from your work in the CISO suite, which is slow down, take a moment, process it, right? And I think it's that cognitive piece, as things are supercharging and getting tailored and personalized, that we're going to really be dealing with as far as the human factor. And I think that's something that your podcast does a really good job of, is humanizing that, because not everyone always understands what CISOs deal with. and the strains that are there as far as having to answer to the CEO or the COO. And that's a challenge, right? And I've seen that throughout my career. So I think you're doing a great job of bringing that human touch and element that's so important to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think it's kind of odd, when you're dealing with inside an organization and dealing with the C-suite, right? Is that lots of stuff happens, right? And we see business email compromises that happen. We have people impersonating the CEO, talking to people in our organization via WhatsApp, and it's amazing how well the attacker is able to impersonate the CEO, right? And then, of course, the question becomes, what I get is, how do we protect against this? And there isn't a lot I can do for people doing, or at least I don't feel like there's a lot that I can do from my point, where I'm working, to defend against what the CEO and the CFO and such are posting online, or how they're interacting on Facebook, and how they're using WhatsApp, in their personal spaces. I can kind of control what's happening inside the boundaries of the corporation, or at least I can give a lot of advice on how to deal with it. But, I guess a lot of it is for me is, be careful what you post, let's, I remember when I was at JP Morgan Chase, we weren't allowed to put in our LinkedIn profiles what our job actually was. I could say I worked for JP Morgan Chase, but I couldn't say anything about my job. I could say, and I think this is still true. If you go look at my LinkedIn post today, you just see like, what is JP Morgan Chase is what it says in my profile. It doesn't actually tell you anything about my job that I had, or what I was doing, or what my accomplishments were. We just try to filter that information out, which I guess helps, but it doesn't really help me on my career journey with people kind of connect with me so they can understand, like, hey, how do I relate to them? Or do I have, similar experiences? Or I guess if there was a recruiter that was looking to hire me, would they be able to look at my JP Morgan Chase part of my job and tell what I did? They wouldn't, right? They would have to actually contact me and find out. But I think those pieces and parts make it really difficult to defend. And, I'm hoping that I'm missing something, and you tell me that there's a magic wand that helps me, help defend the company.
I don't think there's a magic wand, John, but I think, and I think that's the problem that CISOs face. I think that's a problem other intelligence professionals face. It's one of the reasons I joined Valens, because they're nimble and they can move quickly. And that is very refreshing. I'm very proud of my government service, but it's a large behemoth and it's bureaucratic. And it's, I think people have this idea that the government's going to swoop in and save you. They do some incredible work. And I've seen instances where that occurs, but the reality is that so much of what we have to do resides in our own two hands. And so what really draws me to LinkedIn is, and the writing that I do on there, is to make that digestible for a variety of audiences. And I think that's something that you're really doing here on the podcast. I think what it's going to take is a broader discussion of what that threat environment looks like. I mean, back in 2019, most people still thought of privacy as things that they shared on their social media platforms, like you talked about. By 2020, and with the shift in COVID, when we were all at home, we really started to see more of that surveillance commerce, data brokers that were now turning routine app behavior into prediction markets, an explosion of Bluetooth, COVID tracing, and different things that were going on. In 2022, starting to see a lot more smart home data, smart televisions, different things that were entering our home, to where when we lock and close our doors at nights, we think that that's outside of our home, but we're now locked in with the monster, right? And it's very intimate, very personal. And in 2023, right, AI starts to enter the picture, and that starts turning all of this digital exhaust that was individual into a collective ecosystem, to where it's now marketing back to you because it's knowing you very intimately. So I think the role of the CISO is never going to be one that shifts away because it's only going to grow in criticality. But what I think you're bolting onto that is the realization that we're facing ubiquitous technical surveillance. It's not going anywhere. And I think that's really what's shifting is organizations are going to need to expand what belongs to the CISO. It can't just be security in a stovepipe. It's got to be a unified team effort. I don't know what your thoughts are on that philosophically, given your expertise and wide expertise in the field.
Well, I think that what happens. What I mean, I'll be honest. I think that the CISO's job is somewhat difficult just dealing with what's happening. I mean, especially as you work in like bigger and bigger organizations, the number of people that you're dealing with, the number of business units, the number of technical leaders that are driving features out into the marketplace. We're talking about uses of information that helps us target customers better, right? And so I think there's a lot of business value that is and consumer value that's being generated by the use of digital exhaust. It helps us get information or get people who have a problem, they get to see a solution that might work for them quicker, right? So I think that from a consumer perspective, there's a lot of value to it. And again, this is kind of going back into the CISO role where we have to deal with privacy and GDPR and CCPA and those kind of aspects. And we want consumers to know how we're using their data, right? The data that we collect from them. And, people are giving consent kind of free will, I'll say willy-nilly, giving consent all over the place. And so in a lot of ways, consumers have kind of bought into the idea that, hey, this is something that's necessary for me to get value from a platform. I don't think that they understand. I definitely believe they don't understand exactly what it is that they're doing. I think a lot of companies believe that they're asking for consent and that they're doing things with the data that is not what has been consented. But I think it's super difficult to draw that line inside of a company. Even though we're providing a lot of value, I think, from a corporate perspective into the ecosystem, I do feel like there are some places where, and I've never worked for a company that did this, but the idea that you could find out that this person's in this income bracket and that they can pay more for this product than another product, and then maybe they sell it for a cheaper price to this other person because they're in a lower income bracket. I haven't really seen companies do that with information, though I can completely imagine it happening. So I think there's some amount of victimization that I think is possible with the data. But I think from a CISO perspective, we're trying to balance like what the business needs from a marketing and sales perspective with what we're doing with the data that's being used. How do we protect it, make sure that it's being used correctly and within consents, and that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing legally with it. And then, how do we protect the data from external folks that, even though we have consent to use the data, our attackers, the threats against us don't have consent to use that data, of course. And so how do we protect it from external threats from that side? So it's somewhat of
I think you bring up a great point, John. I want to make that clear. It's been it's been the very core of my writing since I started back in early 2019, but it's an ecosystem. What was individual is now an ecosystem. It's really, I guess you could say, threat agnostic in the sense of it's a dual use item, right? It's a fantastic tool. And the concept of digital exhaust came out of business. What's evolved now has become the ability to reach into people's lives in very intimate ways. And so to me, it's certainly won't discount the bit. I mean, we rely on that every day. I mean, how does Amazon know that you're out of dog food, or how does all those different things occur, right? That people enable. I think the broader discussion is, okay, yes, it's always going to be that privacy paradox, right? What is privacy versus convenience, and everyone has a totally different take on that. Having worked what I've worked, I'm very stringent in that. thus not using my last name on this podcast, which I appreciate you letting me do. So I'm certainly not telling people to go bury their head under a rock or put their head in the sand. Nor am I going to go to the extremes that someone like Ted Kaczynski had as far as railing against technology. There's a reason why technology helps humanity, but it certainly is worth the discussion. And I think that's really what you're facing within the job role of the CISO, as far as what had been other stovepipes or silos within security. I don't know that we're going to ever go put that genie back in the bottle as far as that. I think it's a unified approach that requires discussion, sensitization, and those types of things, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, it is. But I think that I mean, definitely. I mean, I think that putting the genie back in the bottle, I don't, that's not going to happen. I don't even know how we would get, I remember having problems with just, primary data sources that we would collect. Right. And then people would take information from our databases and stick it in Excel spreadsheets. And I'd be worried about where that data was. And that was in my on-premise data centers where I controlled everything. And I'm looking for secondary data and tertiary parts of data. In today's world, that's just with the cloud and all these SaaS apps and everything else that we can do and just sign up for, it's an incredible number of places that we would have to defend and protect and try to get those little data streams back into some sort of controlled fashion. The complexity of that's somewhat mind-boggling to me. But I think that, going back to what we were talking about, it's like there's this whole track that the CISO is working on, which is the business track. And then you have the interactions of your C-suite and your employees that are kind of in this consumer world. They're participating in a consumer world every single day. But that the issues for the threats for the company is how that consumerism, right? Their participation in buying things online and social media, etc., how those play together to create threats to the business, right? And I think that's the part that I'm struggling. It's like, it's kind of pretty straightforward for me to handle the protection of the business side. It's that interplay between the consumerism of our employees, whether it's a CEO or a help desk guy or, someone that's doing sales in a store, whatever they're doing outside of the business in their own personal lives, those things do create threats for us inside cybersecurity. And I think that's the part that I'm struggling with, with respect to like, hey, how is AI used to use this information to snap together, put a profile for John Carse here, and then they're going to target me, and I'm incredibly overly cautious about what I look at. And like, if I don't like the subject, I delete. If I don't know who that person is, I delete the message. And if I do see something that's interesting, I open the message. I'm definitely not clicking links. I have a lot of my materials a lot of emails that I have are going through DuckDuckGo, so it strips all the potential leaks of my privacy data, away from the email box that I'm looking at. So I do a lot of things on my own, that are maybe overly cautious, but I definitely don't believe that's not scalable ops for, 20,000 employees or 100,000 employees or 400,000 employees. I just, but all of those employees are generating some amount of threat to the business if that information can be used to target individuals, both from phishing attacks. And I think what I want to talk about a little bit is about like AI sidebar spoofing, etc., and how even, seeing attacks I've seen attacks where, Forbes was compromised as an example. And this is like so many years ago, but it will only show information to someone that came from certain, locations, right? It would only show information to people that came from the finance industry, as an example. And, if you think about like, hey, if I can target this and I know who I'm targeting and I know what their profiles are, and I can say John's in finance. And when someone from finance does this, if I start putting these like pieces together, I can come up with some pretty sophisticated attacks that are very targeted and are going to seem very, very worthwhile to that victim, right? So, so let me transition into that. So, you covered SquareX's AI sidebar spoofing attack in your October newsletter. Let's unpack that for our viewers. What are the real world implications when attackers can impersonate trusted AI assistants right inside the browser?
I mean, I think, what's for the viewers, we were having some discussion prior to the show, and the browser has always been, I think, the bane of a lot of CISO's existence. And I get it, right? These new browsers roll out, people have different preferences. And so that becomes difficult because how do we accommodate flexibility within a culture to maximize productivity without leaving ourselves widely exposed for security? And so I think what's happening here, and when we talk about the implications of attackers that are now impersonating trusted AI assistants inside the browser. And so what's happening, I think, with what we're facing is that this is really, whether it be the sidebar spoofing or enabling AI agents within the browser, it's really the next evolution for the threat. And I think what's really empowering that, again, is why I go back to that. CISOs have always struggled with my writing on digital exhaust. Is there a magic bullet? Is this? Is it? No, it's, guys, it's all the same ecosystem. It's just a little different, right? So when you have a fake assistant who can live inside the same browser panel that a real assistant or agentic assistant or whatever we're enabling can use, that trust becomes the new perimeter, right? And I think it touches on a variety of different issues, right? It's almost like a technological insider threat, where it may not be human, but it is learning you, right? So it knows how to kind of craft things back to you. So the attack doesn't necessarily need to steal your password if it can mimic your trusted interface. So it almost becomes like that old man in the middle, right? Where we always talked about, don't leave your Gmail or your Yahoo logged in for 2 weeks, because now someone can look over your shoulder with a cross-site script or whatever that looks like, man in the middle. So from a security design perspective, right, it's a shift towards verifying who or what is speaking inside your workspace. And that becomes incredibly difficult for a larger company like you talked about, John, where you controlled that perimeter, you've locked down those bring your own devices, but the browser almost makes that obsolete in some aspects, right? So we can control the phones, but the browsers become incredibly difficult, particularly as these AI tools are rolling out and asking us to link to them. And that's a huge challenge that I think you guys are facing in this industry. So where does the line between a helper and an attacker become, more than just design, but technically challenging from a security perspective? And then how much harder is it when an attacker can use digital exhaust, it's widely available, to, like you said, socially engineer and craft that? And I don't want to lose something you said earlier. It is a cultural challenge. Governments by their very nature are reactive, right? Investigative versus maybe being first preventer, not so much. First responder, a little bit better, right? Why do we have all these cool shows? Because no first preventers aren't really like sexy, right? So that being said, in a company like Valens that I joined, they have a much different structure where I can have those interfaces because it's smaller. But good luck. I mean, you tell me, John, but I mean, in your experience, how often do individuals in a larger company have just a direct line to the CISO to let them know about a threat they've encountered? It gets filtered. It takes time, right? I mean, and I'm not knocking that. It's a challenge of the numbers, if you will.
Well, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, if you have a 20,000, 30,000 more, size company, I think that the likelihood of someone that's just going to like reach out to the CISO is probably lower, right? Not, I'm connected, in Teams or Slack, just like any of the other employees. So can they do it? Yes, they can. Do they do it? Yes, sometimes, but they, companies typically know, or the people inside the company typically know, like they're probably going to, talk to the help desk about something, right? They'll have security awareness training. They'll tell them about anti-phishing and, clicking a phishing button to send an email out to the security ops team. We'll train them on using security at whatever the name of the company, so that if they see something, say something and push it out to them. So we have mechanisms where we explain to the user population how to interact with the cybersecurity organization. And so I think those are the kind of the normal channels that people have. But I think that the prevalence of the threats, just if you look at phishing exercises, the number of times that we do phishing exercises, we're trying to get people not to click the link. Number one. Two, we're measuring how many people report it, right? And we'd like people to report it more consistently. But those numbers are typically really low, that people, even if they see something, they don't necessarily report it. Maybe they take the right action and they don't click it, but they don't do that next action, which is report, which is somewhat of the nature of people anyway. The number of people that go out of their way to say that, hey, this is I'm gonna rate you a 10 out of a 10, or I'm going to give you a positive piece of feedback after I had an interaction with your company. Those numbers are really low, right? People complain way more than they expect. So when people are taking the right action, they don't necessarily report that they're taking the right action. So it's kind of this weird dichotomy between just how humans operate that fighting against, right? And maybe fighting is a strong word, that we're wanting people to take actions that aren't their normal human way to behave, which is where I think that something that's helping inside the browser. We were talking this before the podcast started, is that the number of how ubiquitous the browser is, right? And then let's talk a little bit more about the AI agents, where it's now we have this extension that has that's a browser AI agent, or it could be Perplexity's Comet or ChatGPT's Atlas browsers that have the AI sidebar kind of built in. I think that there's a couple of things at play in this dynamic. One is that the software that's running inside your browser, whether it's the sidebar from AI browser or that extension, it has full view of what's going on inside your browser. There's that part. Two, the identity that's being used is your identity, right? So anything that you have access to, it has access to. I think a third element of it is that, and this is on the technical side of the browser. The third element of that is that it's code and it can be circumvented, right? Meaning that, which means that if the agent is compromised in some way, whether that's through through its actual code base, or if it's compromised by indirect or direct prompt injections or some other extension that's manipulating it as well, that you have this other element of just humanity, is that we tend to trust computers. We understand, we give it a prompt, a question, and it comes back with an answer, and we tend to believe it. So we have that trust element of computers that exists because we've been dealing with computers for years. And if we ask it 2 + 2, it gives us back 4. We use calculator all the time, and it's very, very deterministic. Whereas when we use the AI agents, we're in probabilistic kind of expenses.
I was just thinking that, computers are so binary growing up, because my kids don't, for them, they're growing up with this at their fingertips, where this was an evolution for me. They're always surprised when it's been almost 50 years of video games that dad still can play a PS5. They seem amazed, as if I walked off of a time capsule. But you're right, it is probabilistic. It's not binary like we kind of grew up with, and right. Things are changing, right? I think you talk about prompt injections as far as it's just code that's coming in, and what used to be binary numbers and different coding is now written, right? It's written code. And I think that's opening up. It doesn't mean that it's not built on those frameworks, but it's opening up a wider audience of people that don't need technical expertise to do that. And I think what's interesting is, as I hear you say prompt injections, right? We come into the browser and we trust that browser to do certain things. We know to update it, hopefully. We know to do different things. But what the browser almost becomes, John, and what you made me think of as we're talking, is it's almost like the new watering hole attack, right? Instead of going to a website where maybe you're dealing with an iframe, you're coming into that browser. And so now the water hole is personalized to you, right? And that's why those things are so successful. That's why we're seeing such a huge increase in social engineering that's effective. That's why we're seeing that. And so I think that's real. You're hitting on that. And I think that's what the article that I referenced in my newsletter from you guys was really good at translating, because it's really that dialogue that we're having today that needs to happen, right? So for intelligence, it's a very simple equation. Information plus analysis equals intelligence. And so, there are some amazing people on LinkedIn and the networks that we traverse, and you're seeing that really grow. You saw it really grow with the cyber intrusion aspect, and now it's really starting to permeate all things, where the government kind of had a monopoly on that intelligence piece. You've now seen it cross a lot of different industries. And so I think the discussions that we're having today are the ones that are so critical, because if you cannot speak to your target audience, if you cannot decipher that down and make that reader feel the pain point and translate the expertise, right? How do we translate complexity into control? And that's really why I write the way that I do. People are like, oh, you're a great writer, James. Well, thank you. The good Lord has gifted me. But that being said, it's not about me showing off the writing, or it's not about you guys showing off your expertise when you do those articles. Many people are surprised that since the 60s, most New York Times bestsellers have been written about at 8th grade reading level. And I drop that all the time. And so what I really enjoyed about the article that you had was you're really helping decode for a wide variety of audiences what you as a CISO and CISOs need to understand about the threat environment. And then you're bridging that across other threat professionals. And I thought that was really good. That's one of the things that drew me to Valens, was the ability to work with a wide variety of expertise that can do that. And the CEO being a former special forces guy, that's very special forces model, is everyone kind of does what they need to do to get the job done and then salutes smartly. And I enjoy that small team effort, because I think that's where some of our best innovations come in. And I certainly think you guys are doing a great job with this podcast and your writing.
Appreciate it. I think the team will be glad to get your positive feedback for sure. I think that, like, kind of putting this together, right? I just think about like, you're in the browser, you have an enthusiastic agent that's in there that's completely untrained in security. He's using your identities. You're going out to websites that are crafted for you, potentially giving attacks happening in there. And it's like, now you're in this browser space where no one can see what's going on, right? Or typically our traditional security tools don't have that. And I think, like, starting to put boundaries inside those interactions with respect to what extension, like in an enterprise environment, what extensions are allowed. If that AI agent's going to do something on your behalf, how do you limit its impact? Meaning, like, don't allow it to just log into any application. If it starts asking for too much permissions, stop that from happening. Steering where they can go and what context they can work in, where they can copy and paste, and those kinds of things. Like, limit that, like, what that extension and that agent can do. I think you got to start putting those things together as a human operator that just delegated a task as this AI agent, right? And of course, the integrity part of it is incredibly important too, because again, we have a probabilistic agent that's working inside that browser that's going to tell us something or inform us about something. And it's like, was that rewritten? Did something change in the DOM that made it so that it was injected and it's not the actual material that came from that website or from that that LLM? I think those are the kinds of things that we're facing inside the browser, that are proxy servers and our and our EDR tools just aren't able to capture because they're just not in the browser.
And I think that's an evolution, John, of where we're at with the threat as far as, these AI tools are personalized, or you can personalize them with personalities. That's something I covered pretty recently as well. So you may not like an AI tool as much if you change its personality type. It may be cold, it may be detached, right? Whereas people tend to like that warmth and that emotion bridge, right? And so it's designed that way, right? I mean, I laughed when people were always playing Candy Crush. Oh, I can't wait to get on it. Well, who do you think designed it? The people that designed slot machines for Las Vegas. I mean, it
Right.
sounds the same, it looks the same. It's that feeling, right? You hit the big one. And so we've been dealing with these things across industries for some time. And I think that's the evolution that we're all facing, is whether it be CISOs or threat intelligence professionals or governments or small businesses or whatever that looks like. It's making users aware of the personalization, that it's not your friend. It can learn you well, but it's not a human being. Do I appreciate good feedback? 100%. Maybe that's not useful for me. Maybe it's nudging me in different directions, right? So it's almost like we're almost dealing with like a blend of social engineering and insider threat, which I think is novel, right? And it's breaking down those silos, right? In a way, for me, it's no different than what we face as a national security apparatus after 9/11. And people say, well, how do you say that? Like, yes, they were two distinct events, but a lot of the failures that led to 9/11 were stovepipes. And I think this evolution with AI is forcing stovepipes that existed for very good reasons. I'm not saying that they didn't, to be kind of broken down and create a different model. And that's really what we're facing. And this is not going to slow down. And so I think, you talked about people enabling different permissions on their browser. And again, it's not like those are super explanatory when you do that. They're opaque by design, right? Some would call them dark patterns. Some would call them other things. So we have all these terms of art that are out there. And I think that's why this narrative that you're doing here and why I write is to help users break that down, whether I'm speaking to someone with your expertise or whether I'm speaking to someone brand new. And I think that's really what we have to get to, is kind of back to those narratives, those simple smoke signals, if you will, those simple podcasts that aren't so technical that your eyes glaze over. Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but as a CISO, you've probably been in meetings where you knew someone was gone and they're lost, right? And it wasn't anything that you did or they did. It's the challenge of translating incredibly technical information into a distillable format. It is no different than what I'm trained as an analyst. How do I take and process and exploit this information and give you the bottom line up front? Here's what you need to know. Here's the what and so what. And if you want to dive deeper, here you go. That's really the crux of what we do. And we might just call it different things, but it's really the same art, if you will.
100%. I think that the hard part is always, right, taking the technical and making it not technical, right, or making it approachable and understandable without having to understand all the technical details. I think that's one of the aspects of being a CISO that's somewhat challenging, is how do you take technical stuff and make it non-technical stuff for the business users and that you're interacting with. I think it's definitely a skill that needs to be built. Yeah, but it is definitely a challenging space. And I think anytime that we can put, a lot of times we tend to blame the victim, right? There's a lot of blaming the victim, whether they gave up too much information in social media or they got a phishing attack and they click the link. And I often feel that actors are becoming more sophisticated. They're understanding our users better. They're now, with AI, they're able to target more quickly with the amount of data that we have available that's that you can find online today. I think that finding the information with AI, crafting a targeted email, and those kinds of activities are just going to make the attacker more capable and be able to launch more attacks quickly. But I do think that, that we're kind of in a silo in how we think about defensive capabilities, and that adopting additional layers of defense where our users are working, like in the browser. I think putting controls in that place allows us to, and again, going back to we tend to blame the victim, where there are technical controls that we could be putting in place that would allow them to operate in a safer environment. I'm not necessarily saying helmets and seat belts, but, along that line, but we really haven't been taking that approach in the defense of our enterprises. And I think that, as we were talking about before the show started, I mean, I've seen attacks happen through the browser for like decades now. And I was telling you, as I remember particular attacks that happened in the browser going back 10, 15 years, that if we had something that was looking at what was going on in the browser, it could have been prevented, or bigger attacks could have been prevented. And I think I'm just a little bit amazed that we're not spending more time where the user is actually interacting with the environment, right? We think it's the desktop, but it's actually the browser. And I think that's where I'm thinking, stop blaming the victim. If you have controls available that you put in the browser, put them in the browser. It'll help you with, both what your users are doing, whether they're inadvertently an insider threat or or actually trying to be an insider threat, or if you have AI agents. There's lots of ways that we can control inside the browser that prevent these attacks from progressing. And I think that's just how we
well, and I think, I mean,
a big challenge.
I don't have the scientific numbers in front of me, but very few people are going to be true malicious inside threats. Right? Straight, what you're talking about is that inadvertent. Most people want to do well. They don't want to do the wrong thing. And so I think, like you're hitting on, is really, to pull a little Brene Brown on you, right? Like sitting with people where they are versus kind of telling them, right? That sympathy versus empathy. And then, but I think you're right? It's like, there are some people, there's boneheads, and they should get kind of a talking to, right? Because they're the ones that fail over and over and over because they don't care.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you said on a network traffic course to make them,
Yeah. Or like, they're too busy worried about their fantasy football, whatever that is. And we all have those folks. But I think for the most people want to do well, and they don't want to be the weakest link. Right. And then, so I think what you're hitting on is we're in an environment that now we have these tools that are hyper personalized, whether they're behind the browser, like a sidebar attack, or whether it's a spear phishing attempt like we've hit on. I think that's really, it's meeting people where they're at. And I think that was one of the things that I really liked about your article, and it's why I write the way I do. Anyone can talk about problems, but it seems like very few in these industries offer solutions. And that's really what I think we're moving towards, whether it be ingesting a podcast in this format or a written piece. And I think that's what you are doing and what I'm trying to do. And then, like, what companies like Valens are trying to do. And that's what makes it really exciting for me to join them and do different things than what I've done. So I have seen the threats. I've certainly experienced them. What we're facing, I think, is all of us are now facing kind of this critical moment where these threat actors, which took a lot more resources previously, can now force multiply with these tools. And it's a challenge for all of us. And it's going to be an interesting next couple of years, particularly as these tools with AI, like you've hit on, we would go out to those sites and actually access them. Now they're behind the browser or on the device, right? And that's really where we're headed, I think, at the tail end of 2025 into 2026 and 2027. It's hyper personalized. It's right in front of you. And that creates a tremendous challenge for CISOs like you and I talked about.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things I had not thought about until you just brought it up was that it's happening in the device. I mean, what we're starting to see is AI chips coming onto your laptops, right? And now we're going to have like two fronts where we have some inferencing that's happening on our local device, right? And we have inferencing that's happening in the cloud. And so it's kind of like and then if you're, from me working on telecom, I know that we were trying to get inferencing to happen at the edge, right? So if we get on the device, if we have inferencing happening on the edge, right? And then we have, large scale inferencing happening in the cloud. We're kind of pivoting where that work is happening, right? I think honestly, I do believe that a lot of that work's still going to be the interface to that is still going to be the browser. I mean, just that's where, that's where the shift has been happening, is that more and more apps are, just because it's so easy to just create a web app and make it accessible through a browser. I didn't have to deploy another client application to a box to make something work. And that's just an easy way for IT to kind of deploy. But those inferences are going to start happening on the device as well. And I think that that's, over the next few years, like you're saying, I think that how we interoperate with the technology and where we're operating with technology is going to become more complex and distributed in the future. I think it's very interesting. I'm gonna have to ponder that.
We're straddling networks, right? I mean, I could be logged in on my personal browser with AI and be logged into that same AI tool on my work. And essentially, right, you've now bridged that gap. And I think that's what we're facing. And I think you hit on a lot of things. And I think what I really want, and it's something that I stress with my kids, is, I'm not like an archaeological artifact, right? So like I saw these things evolve. So the things that I learned when I was younger certainly apply. Now, that doesn't mean my kids don't have tremendous expertise, but it's the same. I think what you hit on earlier, we didn't really kind of flesh out. It's that human in the loop, right? Where they're making the decision or they're reviewing that from a quality assurance perspective. Even with my writing, I use tools, but I'm very fidgety about things because that's how I am. And then I think it's using these tools as co-pilots, not autopilots. And I think that's what you're doing. But then really with folks like you who have the expertise, it's passing that on, because a lot of the newer users don't know how we got here, when we got here, and what those threats are. And so the things that you were watching for, whether it be little snippets of code back in the day on a controlled network, are still the threats that we're going to face. Now it's just a wider digital footprint and threat footprint, if you will.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your future outlook as well, as we kind of come to the conclusion of this podcast. And what I really want to ask is, for aspiring security writers and communicators, what would your number one piece of advice be?
Well, I think it's write for clarity and not applause. I see a lot of the influencer culture coming over to LinkedIn, and I think there's good and bad with that. My goal isn't to be an influencer per se, but to inform you. So as a trained analyst, my goal is, what does the target audience need, and what is the what and so what? And I think that's where we have to live. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be entertaining. Certainly, I love barbecue. I love smoking ribs, like most people do in Kansas City. I won't start a war and throw Texas into this. I think you guys have better steaks, but I think we have better barbecue. But it's really understanding, who's your target audience? Who are you writing for? Are you writing to just show off that you're good with words? Well, you might be the best with words, but it won't translate into anything if you really don't understand that target audience. And I think that's for any job we do, right? It's particularly writers. And then translate that complexity and control, right? Because when things are chaotic, people do remember calm voices in a crisis. And I think the best communicators can turn fear into focus and help others see their own power inside the problem. And I think when we write to explain the problem, I see a lot of news articles, a lot of tech articles, and I'm sure you've experienced that as well. They're extremely good at describing a problem. But when you get to the very end of that article, does it have some type of solution? Does it have a countermeasure? That's really why I've done what I've done. There doesn't mean there's always a perfect one, but there's generally something we can do to help mitigate a problem. And so I think that's a huge piece that people need to walk away. Like, I can go on and scare you to death about the world falling, and I would sound very convincing because I have that expertise. But give someone something to use to help translate that into something they can do. And I think when you meet that individual there, and it's going to vary, right? I think that's a huge thing. And I think that's something you guys are doing really well with your writing, and there's others in the industry that are. But, these hype pieces, one simple trick, all the things we've seen over the years, right? They're just not really effective long-term. And so I think that's really my takeaway, is know your target audience and really work to give them something to apply, because people appreciate that. They'll remember that and they'll come back to it.
I can't agree with you more. I mean, just being on the buy side, and like so many people tell me that their product's going to be the panacea to my problems, when they don't really understand my problems and that they're just kind of giving me answers. But a lot of times when you go and you see those hype pieces, it's just fear, uncertainty, and doubt that they're selling, and they're saying that they have a panacea. But a lot of times it doesn't come together, right? Because the problems are way more complex. And I think, providing that clarity, providing that means to an end and explain it so that people understand like how complex it is, and then trying to simplify it so they can understand it. I think that's a winning combination. And thanks.
100%. I think the outlook is really like you asked. The outlook is critical thinking is not going to go out of business anytime soon. I think if anything, it's going to be in more demand. And I think the right companies with innovative, nimble solutions that can thread the needle of, we have rigor in what we do. And, with analysis, I mean, it would take me hours or days to set up some of these techniques, and I can now do them in minutes, having rebuilt some of that with AI. But and that's a great thing, right? So how do we loiter more on the critical thinking piece, not getting bogged down in all the, whether it's a CISO dealing with all the bells and whistles of potential intrusions and the tools that you have, or whether it's me as an analyst dealing with collecting information and processing and exploiting it. These areas that have traditionally taken a lot of our time, moving to more of that within the intelligence cycle, the analysis piece of being able to think about that, ruminate on that, let that marinate, if you will, to use my smoke signal language, so that we can actually have that, right? Because like not everything's a microwave solution, right? And sometimes we need a crock pot. So it's just the tool may depend on what we need. But at the end of the day, if we're not stopping to really think about these problems and then how to mitigate them and meet that target audience, we're not going to mitigate them. And these threat actors don't have the same guardrails you and I have. They don't care about the laws. They don't care about any of those things. They care about their bottom line, which is whatever that may be, typically profit, right? So, or harm to people. So those are generally the things that we're dealing with. So I think we've got to do a better job of that kind of tribal wiki of what we know, and then translating that down to where it's distillable. Because if we're not giving that to the next generation, I don't know that we're going to mitigate this.
100% agree. James, thanks for joining the Be Fearless podcast. It was great having you as a guest.
Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it.